Hello, I'm Lyndon Bournon with Brandon Friendship Center Adult Education. Welcome to What We Believe, a series that explores religious beliefs in the Brandon area. Today's episode is possibly going to be a little different because we're going to be exploring Unitarianism, which also can include atheism, so if you like, non-belief. So we may need to adapt our standard set of questions that I've been using during this series somewhat, otherwise could become nonsensical. I'm very happy to have with me today Katie Brockway, who's kindly consented to come in and talk about Unitarianism and also to touch on her own beliefs, or as she said to me earlier, her non-beliefs, but we'll get to that. Katie, could you please give us a bit of I know you've got a very interesting life history, and I wonder if you could just tell our viewers something about that. What you've done so far in life.
Well, what I've done so far in life is I graduated as a physicist from a university in the States and married my husband, who at the time was a Unitarian minister and also a teacher at Hofstra College, and who started the first fellowship of the Unitarian Church. After marriage, I essentially worked with my husband for years. We lived first in Wellesley, Massachusetts for 2 years, and then in Hamilton, Ontario. We were both refugees from the McCarthy era in the States. We had such trouble in our church in Wellesley with the McCarthy era, with people looking for reds under the beds and all the rest of it, that we said, we've had it, we're going, we're leaving. And so we came up to Canada, which was our refuge, and spent 5 years in Hamilton, Ontario. And at the end of that 5 years, we had served our term there, built the church up and everything. Robert wanted to go to England. So went to England for 2 years. He taught in Coventry, England, starting in a secondary modern school with a whole bunch of boys that said, you have to use the strap, sir, and so on, because he couldn't control them. They were dancing on the tables, these kids were so wild. Finally ended up in a vocational school teaching there, and then got a job in Lafayette, Louisiana, back in university again. Wow. We'd left the ministry, of course, by then. And Lafayette, we were there for 4 years, and then taught up here in Winnipeg for a couple of years in the summer. Because in Lafayette, they only paid you for 9 months, and for 3 months you had no pay, and so most of the professors who weren't good budgeters were running out of money for those 3 months, and we would find a job in the summer. And so that's how we got back to Canada, which we always wanted to get to. And from there, he got a job here at Brandon University, 1965. So the rest of the time, we were up here. I took courses later on in psychology, because I was simply interested. I thought, hey, this sounds interesting. I'd had a psychology course in university, and I thought, sounds interesting, let's try it. And I went and I took all their courses. And when I finished all of that, one of my friends who was a psychiatrist said, well, you want to do something with it? I said, yeah, I would like to, but I don't really want a full-time job, type thing. Why don't you volunteer? So I volunteered up at the mental. I think this was in the late 70s. I'm bad on dates. But anyway, I volunteered up there, became a tester up there, and after a whole summer of doing it for nothing, they started to pay me. And I worked half-time there for about 7 years almost until the mental closed.
Right, okay, yeah.
So that pretty well is my life history. I'm now retired, of course, and
yes.
I've lost my husband, unfortunately, so I'm doing it alone now.
Well, thank you very much. So we were talking about your involvement with the Unitarian movement, and of course your husband, as you said, was a Unitarian minister. Where are Unitarian, I'll use the term churches, but I know that's not always the case, and some of them operate as fellowships, but yes. Are they all over the world, Katie?
Pretty well. It has spread pretty well all over the world. It started in Poland and Transylvania, the first really Unitarian churches, except they were called Socinians at that time. Okay. And what it all comes from originally is the Council of Nicaea, which I think is 425 or 325, something like that, which declared the Trinity. That's when the Trinity was established. And of course, there were heretics who didn't believe in the Trinity, which is where the name Unitarian comes from. A Unitarian says there is only one God. Jesus is a leader. You might call him a prophet, but he is not the Son of God. You see, there is only one God, and there's no Holy Ghost. There's just God. So they were called Unitarianisms, and later Socinians, and later that sort of went to other things that they also didn't believe. Like, for instance, let me think of some of the other things they didn't go with, which is very interesting from the Bible. Mainly the divinity of Jesus, of course, and I need my notes here for
Oh,
something.
that's fine.
Yeah, I get a little bit. The pre-existence of Christ, who came down, and actually Christ substituting for us and saving all of humanity.
As an intermediary.
Yeah, they don't believe in that, and they don't believe in original sin.
Okay.
They dropped the idea of original sin, and so therefore they didn't need the atonement sort of thing. And they also, of course, dropped predestination and Calvinism. That's where they had a fight with Calvinism. But your original question, they then spread in England. England started, Joseph Priestley was one who invented oxygen or found oxygen.
Yes.
Was one of the founders of Unitarianism in England. Got into trouble in England when they burnt his house down because they got mad at him and so on. Came to the States, the United States, and was very important in starting Unitarianism in the States. And there were, of course, some very important ones. William Ellery Channing is a very well-known one. And Ralph Waldo Emerson was a minister, a Unitarian minister. And it actually emerged out of Congregationalism, which is very interesting. The Congregational Church was the established church of New England. At that time, the United States actually had established churches. The Anglicans were established in the South, and the Congregationalists in Yankee Land in the North.
Okay.
And the Unitarians emerged first as a sort of a divisive sect within them. And some of them stayed within the Congregational Church, and some of them moved out and finally started the Unitarian Church in the 1800s as a separate church. And that's where the Unitarians in the States came from. Now the Canadians, of course, also got the Unitarians from there, and they started the Canadian Unitarian Council, and finally they've now joined also with the American Unitarian Association. And meanwhile, of course, the Unitarians have joined with the Universalists, which is another interesting story. The Universalists believe in universal salvation. They said that hell, if anything at all, would be temporary, and a loving God wouldn't have a hell, you see. So therefore, they didn't believe that people would be consigned there. They believed in universal salvation. And there used to be a joke in New England about two churches that faced each other, the Congregational Church and the Universalist Church. The Universalists put a sign up and said, "There ain't no hell," on their sign. And the Congregationalists put up a sign, "The hell there ain't." You see? And this is an old joke about these two churches all the time in New England. Unitarianism flourished in New England. Essentially was a New England church, and its headquarters is still in Boston, Massachusetts.
Okay.
But it's all over the States now, and it is all over the world.
And the Congregational Church in Canada joined with the Methodists and I think the United Reformed to become the United Church of Canada back in the 20s.
Yes,
Right?
yes. And at one time, I think it was called United Church of Christ in the States or something like
okay.
this. Yes.
All right.
The name congregational, comes from congregational polity. They hire and fire their ministers. You do not get them from above. They don't get sent out to you the way the Catholics, for instance, work,
Sure.
where you have to put up with the priest whether you like it or not. You can complain, but you get them. But congregational polity is in all of the Unitarian churches, which is nice from one point of view, and not so nice from the minister's point of view, because
Lack of security.
tremendous lack. If you
Yeah,
antagonized the board of your church, you had it, sort of thing. The Unitarians joined with the Universalists some time ago because they essentially were coming to the same thing. The Universalists were coming into a liberal religious faith, the same as the Unitarians were, and it seemed to be silly to have both.
Sure.
And so the two of them now joined, and it's called the Unitarian Universalist Church. Very clumsy title. You use.
Thank you. Now, we were speaking before our camera came on here about the history of the fellowship in Brandon here. Now, I think you were explaining there is no Unitarian fellowship anymore in Brandon, but for many years there was. Can you just tell us a little bit about
Yes. My husband actually started the first fellowship, as it was then called. They were new, and he started the first one in Long Island when he was teaching at Hofstra College. And a fellowship is a sort of an informal organization which is affiliated with the Unitarians, but they don't normally have a building. They frequently do not pay a minister. They either have a volunteer or they have speakers. And it's a very loose type of an organization, a sort of a pre-church, although a lot of them stay fellowships. They like the informality of the fellowship type of thing. And he started that first one in Northport, Long Island, which is now the Unitarian Church of Huntington, Long Island. It has grown. It is now a very large church. When we moved up here, associated there with the fellowship too, but when we moved up here, we found out that Len Evans was starting a fellowship. And he started the Unitarian Fellowship here. He collected some people from the university. He was a university professor at the time. and some people from the community. He had a small group. And when Robert came, this was a very obvious one to ask, to head up this fellowship. So Robert took over being the leader of it, unpaid, of course, the leader of this fellowship, which met down at the Allied Arts Center, which was on Louise Avenue, and I don't remember 11th Street or something like that at the time. And we simply rented the facility there, you see, and met every Sunday, didn't call them services, really meetings type of thing, and had this small group of people, and at one time even a small Sunday school. The Evans were teaching in it. Len Evans' daughter was teaching in it, in the small Sunday school, first a member of it and then teaching in it. And what they would, of course, teach is comparative religions, things like that, ethics, stuff like that, what they would teach. Now, this fellowship lasted for, I think, something like about 10 years. And then the people either died or went away or grew up or something. It just sort of got down to be too small a group to be really workable.
Sure.
And at that time, we said, well, why don't we stop preaching to the converted and actually simply start a humanist alternative program on Access? And Robert and I had this program on Access for something of about 15 years, a weekly program where we would just simply talk about religious topics.
So very much as we're doing on this series, but you did it
Yes.
for a very long period of time. And
Yes.
oh, that's fantastic.
Excuse
Could
me.
I ask you, Katie, I know there are a range of beliefs that are accepted within the Unitarian movement. Do all people who belong in a Unitarian fellowship necessarily believe in God as a supreme being?
No. No, the basic idea of the Unitarian Church is that you develop your own beliefs. It has no creeds of any kind. And the only creed it has, if you want to call it that, is tolerance of other beliefs within the church. Unitarians believe that spiritual growth is something, if you want to call it spiritual, that each person looks for by themselves. And what we would often get in a Unitarian church is ex-Catholics, ex-Protestants, ex-everything, you see, people who are merging out of orthodoxies of one type or another and trying to find something for themselves. And they would end up, you see, in our discussion groups trying to work out what their religion was. And it will verge, excuse me, all the way, a little bit of water,
Yes.
all the way from atheism, where they come to the conclusion that there is no God, and fundamentally, no religion, where you come right down. They're almost anti-religious, or at least non-religious, all the way up to some Unitarians who will call themselves Christians because they believe in the leadership of Jesus.
Okay.
They say Jesus is not God's son, but Jesus was a good man, and he taught a lot of good things, and we believe in the leadership of Jesus, and that makes us Christians. Now, of course, Christians wouldn't agree. Most of them wouldn't, that makes you a Christian. But Unitarian Christians do believe that.
Okay.
They tend to be the more traditionally oriented, having services and hymns and all that sort of thing in their churches, whereas the atheists and the secularists tend to have more meetings with speakers,
Yes,
and
yes.
without responsive readings and hymns and that sort of thing.
Katie, you've already told me that you're an atheist.
Yes.
Have you always been an atheist, or, for how long?
Practically my whole life. I was brought up in the Dutch Reformed Church
Oh,
in New Jersey, and my mother sent me faithfully, though they didn't go to church themselves, they sent me faithfully to Sunday school. It's a very common pattern. You go Christmas, Easter when you're the parents, but the kids go to Sunday school. So I had a lot of trouble in Sunday school not believing all these stories.
okay.
And I was the one who was the pain in the neck, who kept saying, well, that doesn't work. You can't put all the animals on the ark. There isn't any room, and things like this. And this was going on all through Sunday school, so I was not terribly welcome there. But I thought these stories were stupid, that doesn't make any sense. And so finally I remember I was already a teenager. They had a catechism class, where the minister there was going to take a catechism class, at the end of which you would join the church, you see. So, well, I'll give it a try. So the same thing happened, you see. I went all through catechism class, and I couldn't believe anything that went. And so at the end, I said to the minister, he said, well, you're ready to join. I said, no, I'm not. I don't believe any of this. So that was the end of that. And at that point, I didn't know where to go. I just didn't believe. But there wasn't any organization. There wasn't anybody I knew who thought the way I did. My parents didn't. They were sort of vaguely Christian.
Okay.
Vaguely in the sense of, Christmas and Easter. And if you asked them, yes, they believed in God. But it didn't seem to, make much difference in their
Yes.
lives. A lot of that. Nominal Christians, I guess you would call them. But then I read a book by Robert Millikan, very famous physicist who discovered a lot of stuff in atomic energy and all sorts of things like that. And he was talking about his atheism. I said, wow, this is what I am, you see. And all through university, it became very clear to me that I was an atheist. And not really an agnostic. Agnostic says he doesn't know, you
Yes,
see.
sure.
And it's perfectly true, none of us know. But to me, that always seemed very wishy-washy, because atheism to me says that I don't believe in God, and I really don't. There is always a probability that maybe there is a God. I can't prove it. You can't prove non-existence of anything, including Santa Claus. But fundamentally, as far as my life is concerned, I don't believe in God. So I've always been an atheist.
Okay.
My husband is much vaguer,
Okay.
which you might find interesting. He has a sort of a vague belief in a transcendental type of God, a God who doesn't interfere, like the deists believe in the early days. The founders of the American Constitution were all deists. They believed that God created the world and everything, but then he left it alone.
Left it alone.
Yes, deists didn't think in a personal God. God does not interfere. And God is a vague blue blur. You know, he's nothing, you can't describe him. He doesn't look like people, he doesn't talk, you know. He's beyond everything. And Robert was more that way. He always had a vague transcendental belief that there was something out there that was more than humanity and more than what we are. So he was more of a believer than I am, but it was a very vague belief.
What you just said, I know we're going to stray way away from the questions that I've used in the past here, but one of my questions to other participants was, why does God, well, following on from, does God have absolute powers? Okay, and following on from that, why does God allow bad things to happen? And what you were talking about, deists believe that God created the world, but then didn't interfere, which I think causes difficulty for a lot of people in beliefs. Now,
Most people want a personal God.
Most people want a personal God, and the approach of probably most Christian churches is that God is a personal God.
Yes.
Would you agree with that, Katie?
I think most Christian churches, yes. You know, after all, he sent his son down, you see.
Yes.
For the atonement and all the rest of it. He cares what happens to you. You pray to him. When Christians pray to God, they don't expect that they necessarily get what they pray for, but they do think, I think, that they're heard.
Yes.
You know, prayer has power. They think prayer has power. This God does interfere in the natural scheme of things. He does miracles. If you're that type of Christian, you might believe that he actually does miracles. It still does. The Catholics certainly believe in miracles.
Yes.
They keep happening and so on and so forth. Yes, that is a personal type of God. Certainly Robert never believed in that, and I never did.
And would you say, from your experience of being in different Unitarian fellowships, different parts of the world, I mean, is there a sort of a percentage of people within any Unitarian fellowship who might have those kind of beliefs, or you know what I'm getting at? Do the majority think this? But
it depends on the church.
Okay.
It's and on the minister of the church. You know, who the minister is and who they choose very much shapes what goes on in a church, as it would in any church. There's almost always an atheist percentage in a Unitarian church, unless it's a Unitarian Christian church. They're very traditional. Chances are an atheist wouldn't be happy there. And there's almost always some believers in a more personal God who think that God would do some things, you know, some good in the world, you know, some large thing. I'm not too sure how many would believe in prayer or anything like that, but there would be some who would.
Okay.
Who would think that God would interfere in that too. And whether the church is more one way or the other is very much a question of the church. I know when we had our Wellesley Unitarian church that we were in, it was actually a Universalist church when we were first in it. It's the time they were getting together. Most of our people were secular humanists. And they were used to the last minister also was a secular humanist. In other words, believed that people were, you know, determined ethics. Not that God determines what's good, but that people determine what's good and then attribute it to God. It goes the other way, according to secular humanists. And most of them were that way. They weren't, I don't think most of them were actually atheists, but their God, again, was something very vague,
Okay.
very transcendent.
Okay, thank you. And I guess you've asked, do all members believe the same things? And you've clearly said that's not the case.
No, nowadays particularly not. One of the problems with a church that has no is that it also has no boundaries.
Sure, sure.
And so what happens in some Unitarian churches is you get a very peculiar eclectic mixture of Buddhists, Taoists, New Age people who are out there, you know, conducting seances and all that sort of stuff, mystics, pantheists of different types. and also believers of one type or another, secular humanists, atheists, of course, agnostics, a lot of agnostics, and all of this is trying to work together in the building, together.
And would you say, Katie, from your experience of different communities, that for the most part Unitarian churches and fellowships do accept everyone, or do some of them say, well, no, we are only for this sort of
No.
range of people?
No, as far as I know, if you want to join, you join.
Okay.
It's self-selection. If you're not happy, you leave. It's that sort of thing. I don't remember any church ever saying you couldn't join. You could come in and start talking Catholic stuff, and everybody would listen with great interest to you. If you wanted to stay, that was fine. You know, I mean, if you found something in the church that helped you, fine.
One of my questions has been, how do members of your religion view other religions? And I guess you're saying with tolerance. And
Yes, yes. Tolerance would be probably the right term for it. It varies in the amount of respect
okay.
that you have for other religions. One of the things that's going on now is the new atheists. I don't know if you know the new atheists who have written all of these books about atheism, mainly in the States, of course, are a group of people who are tired of being, as they say, in the closet, the hidden atheists. Because surveys have been done in the States as to who you would want to be a president. And the most unpopular group, below races and everything else, are atheists.
Really?
Right at the bottom. And some of the atheists are going around and saying, well, we're supposed to respect everybody's religion, but nobody respects our lack of religion.
Okay.
If you say, I mean, no congressman, I think there's one who admits to being an atheist.
Okay.
But almost no politician would get up and say, I'm an atheist. Almost no public figure would say, I'm an atheist. They would say somehow or other, well, you shouldn't say that, you know, people won't like that. I'm not going to say that sort of thing. So they're in the closet, the same way as homosexuals used to be in the closet.
Is that true in Canada as well?
Yes.
Sorry.
Yes. As an atheist, I have to put up with a lot of Christian stuff all the time. Almost every public meeting I go to starts with a prayer. And what is that prayer? It's Christian. And I think to myself, well, there are Jews around here. They're putting up with this. Why do they put up? Why are we starting this way, you know? I don't believe this. I don't want to pray. I don't want to bend my head, and so on and so forth. So as I go back to saying you have a tolerance for it, I would certainly not burn anybody at the stake, as the Unitarians, by the way, were burned at the stake. Servetus, a famous one, who was burned at the stake for his beliefs.
And where was that, Katie?
Oh, that's in Europe.
Okay.
Michael Servetus, a very famous chappie who got burnt at the stake during the Inquisition type of thing, and a lot of people who believed this way, liberal people, were burnt at the stake because heresy was a very serious thing in Europe during these times. Tolerance is one thing, in other words, but respect is another. And these new atheists are saying, well, I respect all people, but I don't necessarily respect your belief, any more than I would respect the fact that you're a communist, or that I would respect the fact that you're a conservative or a liberal. I'll argue with you.
Yes.
If I'm a conservative, I'll argue. And the same way, I should be able to argue about being an atheist. I shouldn't have to respect it and keep my mouth shut.
So would you say, do members of the Unitarian community feel obliged to try and convert other people? So feel obliged to say to Catholics, for example, you shouldn't believe that, or?
No. I don't think we've ever proselytized. We put our point of view in books and writings and things like that. But if you want to be a Catholic, you can be a Catholic. But if a Catholic comes up and tries to convert us, they better look out, because we'll answer.
Yes.
You see,
yes.
we'll answer.
What about, how does a Unitarian group deal with members who choose to leave?
That's
Or
fine.
it's fine?
Actually, it's interesting. In the Unitarian Church in Hamilton, we often notice that people would come for a number of years and then go.
Okay.
And when we talked to him, Robert would ask something, well, we haven't seen you for a while. Well, we've had that now, you know, we agree, and we don't need it anymore. In other words, it was sort of like an educational thing, or like a university. You don't stay there your whole life.
Right, yes.
You spend a number of years dealing with the problems of having left Catholicism or having left Buddhism or having left something else. And you deal with those and you work out your philosophy. When you got it worked out, you think, well, what am I going for now? You know, I'm finished. So that the only thing they would go for is community, which of course is a very important function of all churches. But some people don't feel a need for that either. They just join other kinds of groups.
Do many Unitarians believe in an afterlife?
I doubt it.
Okay.
That again would be a question, some would and some wouldn't. I don't myself, because again, it doesn't make any sense. I'm a scientist,
Yeah.
and there's no proof. And there's no proof whatsoever. So I just can't see it. It makes no sense. My animals die, I die, I'm an animal.
Okay. And in your experience of Unitarian fellowships in the States and in England and in Canada here, in any particular group of people, you said there'd be some, but not the majority of people?
Don't think so. I'm guessing here. I'm
Okay.
guessing. I mean, you end up with these New Age people, and they believe an awful lot of mystical stuff. You know, they have seances and everything else. They're actually a revival of the old spiritualists, is
Sure.
what they are.
Yes.
But they've given it a new name, New Age. But tarot cards, you know, and crystal balls and all the rest of this stuff. So they definitely, you know, they believe in an afterlife
Yeah.
of a sort. And, you know, people come back to you if you want them to come back. But I think most Unitarians wouldn't.
Wouldn't, okay.
It certainly doesn't motivate them to be good or bad or anything like that. They you know, it would be irrelevant. Something, well, maybe it's true, but who knows, you know, type of thing.
And I know you said this can vary very much from one community to another. What sort of thing might a person who is new to a Unitarian fellowship expect to find if they went to a meeting, if you like a fellowship meeting? What sort of things might they expect?
If they go to what they call the service or the meeting, they would probably find an interesting talk of some
Okay.
sort. It would be called a sermon in a more traditional Unitarian church. It would be called a talk in a less traditional one. But it would be the same thing. The minister or whoever is leading it would have a discussion, might talk about Buddhism and the good ideas in it, might talk about the history of religion, might talk about ethics, might talk about politics and how ethics flavors it, might talk about social action, which Unitarians are big on, by the way.
Okay.
Social action is one of the things that unites them very often,
Okay.
getting together on social action. So at the meeting, you would get something like that. And then almost always, there's a discussion afterwards of some sort. Even in the traditional churches, everybody goes down, there's coffee and all the rest of it, and then the arguments start. You know, and then the fun starts, you know, between all of the people who think this way or that way and agree with the sermon, don't agree with the sermon or the speech. And the whole thing just takes off into a discussion, which sometimes can go on for ages.
So discussion is very welcome. It's certainly not just the case of sitting and listening to somebody else
No.
telling you things. It's very much a participatory kind of
Very
situation.
much. In almost all of them, they would have separate meetings. Some of these groups, you know, that have specific beliefs, like the New Agers and stuff, would have meetings where they can have their discussions, but everybody's welcome to them, of course.
Right,
But
right.
after the church Sunday service is almost always a discussion where everybody takes part.
Does the Unitarian movement attempt to attract younger members?
It usually has a Sunday school.
Okay.
Most churches do. Now, fellowships don't always have Sunday schools because they don't always get that organized. But I think most churches do have Sunday schools. But they are not in order to put beliefs into kids. You know, it's not to teach them beliefs. It's not to teach them creeds or anything like that. Certainly not to teach them the Bible, which Unitarians consider to be simply literature, a work of literature, not the Word of God.
Okay.
I don't think any of them believe it's the Word of God. So, at Koran either, or any of these texts. So that the kids would learn in a Sunday school like that about ethics, about how you treat other people, how to be a good person, you know, in the world, and how not to be a bad person in the world, and about other religions. Comparative religions is almost always taught. They have textbooks that have been written by Unitarians teaching the good things of all the religions and what they believe so that you understand your neighbors
Yes.
and what they believe. But it's taught that way, you know, and if you want to go and believe that, that's fine too. A child can say, well, I agree with that. I'm a Buddhist. I'm really a Buddhist. Say, well, that's fine, you know. That's nice, you know, good for you. And nobody would argue with them if they want to be that. Fine, be a Buddhist. And from then on, that person would argue from Buddhist perspective, that would be okay. So that young people are attracted that way. Mm-hmm. But actually, most people come to the Unitarian Church, I think, as adults, actually. Very often the ones that go to Sunday school as kids don't attend the Unitarian Church later because they've already had it all.
They've
you know?
had all that, yes.
Yeah,
yes.
they know what their philosophy is, and they're living it, and they're joining social action groups and the Council of Canadians and things like that. They don't need a church anymore. Mm-hmm. They join whatever they want, you know, type of thing. Which, of course, atheists do too. Atheists don't have churches, usually, of their own. Occasionally they have discussion groups, but normally we just simply take part in other groups
Sure.
that foster what we believe in.
Katie, are services or meetings open to anyone?
Yep.
And nobody needs to phone ahead or anything like that. Can you just show up if there is a fellowship in your community?
That's right. There's a Unitarian church in Winnipeg. It's been there for years and years and years, fairly large one, quite successful. Very large church. I think it has a lady minister, at least it did recently when I heard about it. There's not one in Brandon. Somebody phoned me up not too long ago wanting to know because they had found on the internet something about the fact that there used to be a fellowship here. They wanted to know if there was one here, and I told them, no, I'm sorry, there isn't. You can start one, but there isn't one right now. Anybody can start one.
Well, there you go.
Yeah.
It's been wonderful talking to you, and it was nice talking to you before we were on camera as well about a mutual friend in the past, Fred Kruger, as well. He was just a great guy and somebody I feel honored to have known. Katie, anything you'd like to add in terms of either your own beliefs or things to do with the Unitarian Church that you think people might find interesting to know?
Well, it's hard to say. I think a program like this is very valuable because it gives people all the alternatives that are out there. People often live within their own religion, their own Sunday school, their own minister, their own church, their own beliefs, and they really don't come to terms with the others. And in a sense, a program like this is sort of a course in comparative religions.
Well, it's certainly been one of our aims, and I guess